You're listening ad-free on Amazon Music.
20-year-old Michelle Rivera looked around the lobby of the glittering Las Palmas Hotel in Manila, the capital city of the Philippines. It was 10 p.m. on the evening of Monday, June 4th, 1990, and the beautiful young woman with long black hair was about to have her first ever face-to-face meeting with her future husband, who had just arrived from America. Looking up at her father, who was standing next to her, Michelle squeezed her dad's arm even tighter as she tried to control her excitement and also her nerves. If everything went well, and Michelle prayed that it would, then very soon she might be spending her honeymoon in one of the fancy suites somewhere inside this glamorous and expensive 23-story hotel. But all that depended on what happened over the next few hours. Michelle knew that her father, a carpenter from their tiny village located far away from this grand hotel, had serious doubts about how his daughter had met up with the man they were about to meet here in this lobby. But Michelle was sure that once her whole family got to know Jonathan Nice, it wouldn't matter that she and the successful scientist from North Carolina had met through what was basically a mail-order bride catalog. As Michelle had kept telling both her parents, in the 11 months since Jonathan had first seen Michelle's picture and answered her ad in the Lonely Hearts section of the Manila Times newspaper, the practical reasons they had for placing and responding to that ad had soon been replaced by genuine feelings of love and compatibility. And after almost 1 year of exchanging letters, cards, and gifts through the mail, the marriage proposal that Michelle had received from Jonathan just 4 months into their correspondence now seemed like the answer to both their prayers. For 34-year-old Jonathan, the long-distance courtship had offered the once-divorced and socially awkward scientist the chance to find a wife without really leaving his lab or taking valuable time away from his current research. That research focused on finding a revolutionary cure for asthma, a lung disease that causes episodes of wheezing and breathlessness. And when Jonathan's Filipino coworker had shown Jonathan Michelle's picture in the Manila Times, right away, Jonathan was struck by her youth and beauty. And as soon as Michelle answered Jonathan's first few letters, Jonathan was sure he had found the person he was looking for. A gorgeous partner who was willing to give him a family, be a stay-at-home mom, and focus her attention exclusively on caring for him and their kids. For Michelle, the educational, financial, and cultural roadblocks she had faced ever since graduating from high school had eventually convinced her that marrying a successful American might be her best bet for moving up in the world. So far, her attempts to make that happen on her own had failed. At the age of 16, armed with an outstanding academic record, Michelle had left the Rivera family's bamboo house perched on stilts over the water to attend the National College of Business Administration in the bustling and exciting city of Quezon, 6 hours to the south. But less than 1 year later, Michelle's father could no longer afford the tuition. And so, at the age of 17, Michelle set aside her dream of a professional career and found employment in a city closer to her hometown. Living with her aunt, Michelle would spend the next few years working at a dress shop near the U.S. Naval Base in Subic Bay. The American servicemen and women and their families who lived on and near the base seemed rich compared to the average Filipino, and it wasn't long before Michelle had joined hundreds of other young Filipino women in dreaming of finding an American husband who might take her to the United States. And one way to make that connection was to sign on with Manila's pen pal agencies that promised to find Michelle new male friends in America. And by the time Michelle and Jonathan had begun their correspondence, Michelle, who had very little experience in the world, was captivated by the life she imagined she would have with Jonathan. Her one concern, the fact that he was 12 years older than she was, had evaporated when Jonathan had sent her a picture of himself that showed a tall, fit, and handsome man with thick blonde hair, blue eyes, and a warm smile. He looked every part the former athlete who had played basketball back in college, and who had taken very good care of himself ever since. Michelle had spent the past year looking at that photograph, and she had no doubt that in addition to the emotional connection she and Jonathan had made in exchanging heartfelt letters with each other, as soon as they actually laid eyes on each other, they would feel an instant physical attraction too. Now, Michelle could feel her heart beat faster every time the elevator stopped in the lobby. But when the man Michelle had been waiting for finally did step out of that elevator, Michelle did not recognize him, at least not right away. It wasn't until Jonathan Nice caught sight of Michelle and her father and walked quickly over to where they were standing that Michelle realized with a shock that the flushed, overweight, and balding middle-aged man standing right in front of her must be her future husband. 14 years later, on a snowy day in mid-January 2004, Michelle Rivera Nice was standing alone in the state-of-the-art gym that her husband Jonathan had built for her inside of their $1 million home in the pricey rural community of Titusville, New Jersey. Looking out one of the windows at the beautifully landscaped lawn, Michelle thought about the real cost of hiring Ostrich Nursery just over 3 years ago to plant the snow-covered trees that were now large enough to shade the 3-acre property. Michelle could still remember the first time she met the head of the Ostrich Nursery landscaping crew, Miguel de Jesus, the stocky and strong 34-year-old Puerto Rican who went by the nickname Enyo. He had knocked on the door of the Nice's 21-room, 3-story colonial-style house to give Michelle a summary and bill for the work that his crew had done so far. Michelle could also remember the instant attraction that she and Enyo felt for one another. But it would be another 9 months before Michelle and Enyo actually began the physical affair that had cost so much more than the $50,000 Jonathan had given his wife to get those trees planted. Michelle had not planned or expected to cheat on her husband Jonathan. In fact, until the last few years leading up to her meeting with Enyo, Michelle had thought overall her marriage had been pretty solid. Once Michelle had gotten over the shock she had felt when she first saw Jonathan in the lobby of the Las Palmas Hotel, she had still decided to go forward with their marriage. The real Jonathan may have looked older and less attractive than the picture he had sent her, but in the 7 days they had spent together after he arrived in the Philippines, Michelle believed that their feelings for one another were still the same. And after getting to know Jonathan and seeing how much he obviously adored their beautiful 20-year-old daughter, Michelle's parents had given the couple their blessing. And on Monday, June 11th, 1990, about 1 year after Jonathan had answered Michelle's Lonely Hearts ad in the Manila Times newspaper, Jonathan and Michelle, looking radiant in a beautiful white gown Jonathan had bought for her, were married at a civil service in Michelle's hometown of Orion. After that, in the 7 months that it took Michelle to get the visa that would allow her to join Jonathan in the United States, Jonathan not only set up a generous bank account for Michelle, he also took a second job so he could send regular checks to Michelle's entire family. Jonathan had also come up with a cover story that he and Michelle would tell his family and colleagues when Michelle did appear by Jonathan's side at East Carolina University in the town of Greenville, where Jonathan was a professor. To avoid the embarrassment of Michelle being seen as a mail-order bride, the couple would explain that they had met and married in Hawaii while Jonathan had been away at a conference. And a little over 9 months to the day from Michelle's arrival stateside in April of 1991, the marriage between Michelle and Jonathan delivered on the promise they'd made each other to have a family together. In January 1992, the couple welcomed their first child, and 22 months after that, they welcomed their second son. And 6 years after that, they welcomed their third and final child, a daughter named Samantha. By then, local gossip over Michelle's youth and sudden appearance had died down, and she had been warmly accepted by Jonathan's friends and family. Jonathan had also delivered on the promise he'd made to Michelle that marriage to him would mean a life of financial comfort and stability, not only for Michelle, but for her family back in the Philippines. And by the end of 1998, a little over 9 years since their marriage, all of Jonathan's hard work and long hours at the lab catapulted the couple from the ranks of the financially comfortable into the ranks of the truly wealthy. That's when Jonathan's research into a cure for asthma grabbed the attention of the $4 billion asthma drug market, and Jonathan launched his own multi-million-dollar company called Epigenesis. 2 years later, by early 2000, the family had moved from their apartment in Greenville, North Carolina, to their huge house here at No. 1 Keithwood Court. But for Michelle, there had been a dark side to her husband's success. With each passing year of their marriage, Michelle had really begun to notice that Jonathan was becoming a more and more possessive and controlling partner. He had gone from being proud of being seen in public with his attractive young wife to feeling jealous when any other man so much as looked at her. After Michelle had joined a local gym and become interested in a career as a personal trainer, Jonathan had responded by building a gym inside their home, so Michelle, dressed in form-fitting clothes, would no longer have any reason to leave the house if she wanted to work out. And when Michelle went back to the Philippines to visit her family for the first time in 9 years, Jonathan had refused to let her take their children with her to see their grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. The landscaping project had been another one of Jonathan's efforts to control Michelle's growing restlessness, and also the loneliness and isolation she was feeling, because Jonathan was now spending so many long days working at Epigenesis. Jonathan had given her that $50,000 and told her to do whatever she wanted to make the property outside their house as beautiful as all the new furnishings had made the inside of their house. By the time Michelle picked up the phone and called Ostrich Landscaping, Michelle had also begun to suspect that despite their lavish lifestyle, Jonathan's company, Epigenesis, might not be doing as well as Jonathan kept saying it was. Despite his constant work and travel, investors were starting to lose confidence not only in the drug that Jonathan was developing, but also in Jonathan's performance as CEO of Epigenesis. Not to mention the fact that Jonathan had started drinking heavily. But even though these stresses and strains on their marriage had caused friction between Michelle and Jonathan, it wasn't until Michelle discovered what she thought of as a huge betrayal of trust that the Nice's marriage really started to fall apart. That betrayal of trust was a lie that Jonathan had told her right at the beginning of their relationship. Because back in 1989, not only did Jonathan send Michelle a picture of himself that had been taken when he was much younger, he had also lied to Michelle when he told her he was just 34 years old. In fact, when Jonathan answered Michelle's ad in the Manila Times, he was not just 14 years older than his 20-year-old bride-to-be, he was actually 40, making him twice as old as Michelle, whose biggest concern about their relationship had been their age difference. And when Jonathan had filed all the paperwork required to make their marriage legal in both the United States as well as in the Philippines, Jonathan had also falsified his age. Having seen that doctored paperwork, it never occurred to Michelle to question Jonathan's age until more than a decade later when she and Jonathan's mother were talking about an upcoming birthday. When Michelle commented on Jonathan's age, her mother-in-law looked surprised and then dropped the bombshell that would turn what remained of Michelle's love for her husband into anger and resentment. In May of 2002, Jonathan would not be turning 44, he would be turning 52. To Jonathan, that lie he had told so many years ago might have seemed unimportant once he and Michelle had fallen in love and gotten married, but to Michelle, finding out about it 12 years later felt like a perfectly timed blow that would break open all the cracks in their marriage. When Michelle, aged 32, first met the handsome gardener, Enyo, the two of them talked together over coffee. After that landscaping project was finished, Michelle and Enyo, who had a common-law wife and 3 kids, exchanged phone numbers and talked by phone. But it wasn't until a few months after Michelle had found out that her husband had lied to her about how old he was that Michelle made the step from having an emotional affair with a man whose life was even more complicated than her own to having a sexual affair. Now, 2 years after Michelle's first meeting with Enyo in a seedy pay-by-the-hour motel room the next town over from Titusville, the Nice's stable and prosperous marriage and life was going down the drain. 1 year after the affair started, Jonathan, who had been suspicious about Michelle's sudden and frequent absences from the house, had checked her cell phone and discovered that his young wife was cheating on him. Enyo's wife had discovered the same thing and had kicked Enyo out of the house. After that, Jonathan went to the police claiming that he'd gotten a call from Enyo demanding $500,000 or Enyo would go public with a recording he had made of having sex with Michelle. Even though police couldn't prove Jonathan's claim, the investigation had turned the couple's lives upside down. There had been a confrontation between Enyo and Jonathan, who had taken out a year-long restraining order against Enyo that forbid Enyo from coming anywhere near Michelle or the Nice home. There had been angry calls from Enyo's wife, and Enyo himself had begun asking Michelle for money. And then everything else had fallen apart too. Jonathan's new cure for asthma turned out to be a failure, and 10 months ago, in March 2003, the board of directors at Epigenesis had fired Jonathan and kicked him out of the company he had founded 9 years earlier. The board had given him a generous stipend, but it wasn't enough money to support the family's expensive lifestyle. And 4 months later, Michelle overrode her husband's objections and got a part-time job working 25 hours a week behind a cosmetics counter at the local mall. Jonathan himself was now spending almost all day at home, enjoying time with his 3 kids, and also watching Michelle, who was now actively talking about wanting a divorce, even as Jonathan was begging her to stay with him and work on their marriage. Now, letting out a deep sigh, Michelle took one last look through the window before turning away and leaving her workout room. The snow that had fallen the night before had been enough for area schools to close for the day, but Michelle knew that the mall was still open despite the weather. Glancing at her watch, Michelle saw that it was close to 4 p.m., time for her to shower, change into her black uniform, pin her brass Chanel name tag to her breast pocket, and head to her evening shift behind the Chanel counter at Macy's department store. A few minutes after 4, Michelle heard the sound of Jonathan's car in the driveway. He had taken the 3 kids out sledding, and now they were home just for a few minutes before heading off to Samantha's gymnastics class, just long enough for Michelle to say hello and goodbye to all 4 of them, and for Michelle to remind Jonathan that after work she'd be meeting up with a girlfriend at the mall, and then Jonathan and the kids all piled back into Jonathan's brand new big red Hummer and drove away. But even though snow seemed to be the only thing that set that Thursday afternoon apart from the dozens of other Thursdays that had come before, January 15th, 2004 was anything but usual for Michelle Nice. Because by the time Michelle walked out of the house that she and Jonathan could no longer afford and climbed into the Toyota Land Cruiser that they could also no longer afford, the mail-order bride from the tiny village in the Philippines had finally arrived at a decision about her marriage and her future. Putting the big green SUV in gear, Michelle headed out in the gathering darkness towards Quaker Bridge Mall, where she would clock into work at exactly 6:03 p.m. Along the way, Michelle kept checking her rearview mirror. It wasn't just the fights with Jonathan that had been keeping her on edge lately. As Michelle had recently told her close girlfriend, as well as her husband, Michelle had begun to suspect that when she did leave the house, there was someone out there who had begun keeping an eye on her. It wasn't until the maintenance crew from the local gas and electric company saw the dark green Toyota for the second time, still sitting with its front wheels partly submerged in Jacobs Creek, its engine still running, that they decided to stop. It was around 7 a.m. on Friday, January 16th, and the 2 men had spent the entire night working on electric poles and wires that had come down in the recent snowstorm. They'd first spotted the Land Cruiser an hour earlier on their way to get breakfast. Even though the SUV was parked 15 feet below the roadway, it was still easy to see, and with its engine on and front wheels standing at about 6 inches of water, the men had assumed that the vehicle must belong to a local hunter or someone who was out fishing. Now, breakfast finished and heading back to work, the men weren't so sure. And a few minutes later, after scrambling down the snowy embankment from their service truck to take a closer look at the Toyota, their curiosity and concern turned to horror. It wasn't just the frozen blood smeared on the outside of the vehicle and staining the snow next to the driver's side door. It was what the men saw when they looked through the driver's side car window that caused them to stumble backward and grab for their phones. Within minutes of the 911 call to the Hopewell Township Police Department, Jacobs Creek Road was swarming with emergency vehicles responding to the frantic report of a dead body found inside of the dark green Toyota Land Cruiser near an abandoned campsite down at the edge of Jacobs Creek. By the time Detective Daniel McEwen had arrived on the scene an hour later, the area was roped off with red accident tape, and medics had confirmed that the person inside the vehicle was in fact dead. Meanwhile, after finding out the license plate numbers, police also discovered that the car was registered to Jonathan and Michelle Nice, a wealthy couple who lived at No. 1 Keithwood Court, half a mile away. But as Detective McEwen climbed out of his parked car and slid down the slope to the accident scene, he had already recognized the dark green Toyota Land Cruiser. And when he looked inside the open driver's side door, the 40-year-old investigator could also instantly confirm the identity of the woman whose battered, bloody, and frozen body lay slumped over the center console. Because it was Detective McEwen who had handled the investigation 6 months earlier into Jonathan's claim that Michelle's lover, the gardener Enyo, had tried to extort $500,000 from the wealthy founder of the drug company Epigenesis. Now, as the detective looked at the mangled body of Michelle Rivera Nice, his first thought, hasn't this family been through enough? Was immediately followed by the realization that what he was looking at was not the result of a tragic car accident. Despite the red accident tape that was strung up around the vehicle, when the detective stepped back and looked around, he took in 3 key details that all pointed to a much darker and more disturbing cause of death. First, there was a set of footprints made by someone wearing large work boots that led away from the passenger side of the car and back up the embankment to Jacobs Creek Road. There was no sign of damage to the vehicle that would have been consistent with the driver losing control of the car and plunging down the 15-foot embankment or colliding with another vehicle. And then there was the position and condition of Michelle's body. The driver's seat where she sat, all 5 foot 2 inches of her, was pushed so far back from the steering wheel and floor pedals that it would have been impossible for her feet to reach the brake or accelerator. As for her injuries, it looked like Michelle's wounds were the result of blunt force trauma, not the result of a car crash. If Detective McEwen was right, it was possible that Michelle had actually been attacked somewhere else and then driven by her murderer here to this secondary crime scene where the murderer tried to make it appear that Michelle had been killed in a car accident. Even before investigators from the New Jersey State Police Major Crimes Unit arrived on the scene at 10:30 p.m. that Friday night to coordinate the investigation, Detective McEwen's past experience with the Nice family had made him the obvious choice for lead detective on this case within the local Hopewell Township Police Department. Operating now on the possibility that what they were looking at was a homicide and not an accident, the Hopewell Township Police had already switched gears into investigation mode. As soon as officers had informed Jonathan Nice that his wife had been in a car accident, they would have enough information from her husband about Michelle and where she had been the night before that they could start interviewing Michelle's friends and acquaintances, as well as her co-workers at the Quaker Bridge Mall, including the woman that Michelle had said she had plans to meet up with after her shift at the Macy's Chanel counter. But for Detective McEwen, who knew that the first 48 hours of a murder investigation were critical, because that was when the most people were assigned to the case, and also when there was the most publicity that might generate leads, his plan was to focus on the people who he already knew had intense and troubled connections with Michelle Nice. And at the top of that list was her husband, Jonathan. Although Detective McEwen had never been able to prove Jonathan's claim that he was the victim of an extortion scheme, Detective McEwen had learned a lot about the Nice family when he dug into that allegation 6 months earlier, back in July of 2003. At that time, Michelle had admitted to the detective that her husband was right when he'd accused her of having an affair with Miguel Enyo de Jesus, one of the crew leaders from the Ostrich Nursery. And the detective had seen firsthand the turmoil that affair had caused, the confrontation between Jonathan and Enyo, the fight over the restraining order against Enyo, the angry phone calls that Enyo's wife had made to Michelle. Michelle had also told the detective and Jonathan that she had ended the affair after Enyo had started asking Michelle for, quote, loans, end quote, and showing as much interest in her finances as he was showing in her. So, while crime scene techs continued to photograph and collect evidence at Jacobs Creek, and local officers fanned out to interview the nicest neighbors, Detective McEwen and his partner hopped into their unmarked police car and headed out to No. 1 Keithwood Court to get a formal statement from Michelle's husband. And by 11:15 a.m., Jonathan, distraught and haggard, was ushered into the Hopewell police station and seated behind the desk that was right across from the desk where Detective McEwen and his partner sat. Jonathan had been told about Michelle's death before the investigators arrived. Dazed and confused, he had agreed to have a police officer stay at his home with his 3 kids so he could leave immediately with investigators. According to Jonathan, the last time he had seen Michelle was at 4 p.m. on Thursday afternoon when he had brought their 3 kids home from sledding for a few minutes before heading right back out to gymnastics. When they left the house, Michelle was getting ready for work, and she had told Jonathan that after her shift ended at 8 p.m., she was going to meet up with a girlfriend. After the kids ate dinner, Jonathan made a call to Michelle that went straight through to voicemail, and he and the children all left a message saying goodnight, and then all 4 of them, Jonathan and his 3 kids, watched a movie together and fell asleep in Jonathan's bed. Jonathan told police it was about midnight when he woke up again and realized that Michelle was still not home. When he dialed her number, his call went straight to voicemail again. With a meaningful look at Detective McEwen, Jonathan explained that despite Michelle's earlier claim that she had ended her affair with Enyo, Jonathan suspected she was still cheating on him. So even though it was unusual for Michelle to stay out this late, Jonathan wasn't surprised. He assumed she must be with one of her lovers, which would also explain why she still was not home that morning. So instead of trying to find Michelle, Jonathan only stayed up long enough to take an anti-anxiety medication prescribed by his doctor, hoping just to calm himself down. Not only could the three nice children, aged 12, 10, and 5, confirm that their dad was at the house with them last night, and that they all slept together in Jonathan's bed, Jonathan also told the detectives that if Michelle had died under suspicious circumstances, the person they should be talking with was Enyo. And here, the research scientist reminded Detective McEwen about Enyo's extortion demand the previous summer for $500,000. Before getting a ride home from the police station, Jonathan also told police that lately, Michelle had begun complaining that she was being followed when she was out in town, maybe by Enyo or one of the gardener's friends, his wife, or maybe another family member. Rubbing at his shadowed eyes, Jonathan said that he wished now that he had taken her concern more seriously. And by midday Saturday, Detective McEwen and every other officer assigned to the Michelle Nice investigation were also feeling a new sense of urgency, because the medical examiner's report, issued at 4 p.m. on the 17th, had confirmed that Michelle Nice had been murdered, and that the cause of death had been a savage beating. 2 hours after that report was issued, the other prime suspect on Detective McEwen's list, Miguel Enyo de Jesus, accompanied by his attorney, walked into the Hopewell Township Police Department. During the extortion investigation the previous summer, Detective McEwen hadn't just found out a lot about Michelle and Jonathan Nice, he'd also found out a lot about Enyo. Like the fact that the gardener used several different names and social security numbers in an effort to avoid paying court-ordered child support to a family from an earlier relationship. The detective had used those various aliases to finally track Enyo down at an apartment he was sharing in Cranberry, New Jersey with his common-law wife, Patricia, 40 minutes east of where the Nice family lived. But it wasn't until Enyo had lawyered up that he was willing to speak with investigators. And with that lawyer sitting next to him, Enyo made a series of admissions that would put him squarely in police crosshairs. According to Enyo, he and Michelle had resumed their affair just 2 months after Michelle had told her husband that the affair was over, and while Enyo was still subject to the restraining order to keep away from the Nice family. Enyo also admitted that he had met up with Michelle on Thursday night before she was killed, when the couple had rented a cheap motel room for 2 hours. But Enyo, like Jonathan Nice, also had an alibi. According to the gardener, after they had checked out of Mount Motel, Enyo had driven Michelle back to the Quaker Bridge Mall and kissed her goodnight at 12:30 a.m., just as Thursday night clicked over into Friday morning. Then, in an effort to hide where he'd been from his wife Patricia, Enyo said he met up with a friend at a bar 40 minutes from Michelle's home before heading to his own house at 1:15 a.m., where his wife was awake and waiting for him. But even as officers prepared to test every minute of Enyo's alibi, the investigation into Michelle's death was about to go in a whole new direction, because Detective McEwen had found himself circling back to a comment that Michelle's husband had made almost 2 days earlier. The detective did not know it at the time, but that comment would end up being the key to solving Michelle's brutal murder. And by Sunday, January 18th, just 72 hours after Hopewell Township Police had received the 911 call reporting the discovery of her body down at Jacobs Creek, investigators had identified and were preparing to arrest Michelle's murderer. Based on what police discovered when they followed up on Jonathan's offhand remark to Detective McEwen about Michelle's last day alive, here is a reconstruction of what really happened on the night that Michelle was killed. By the time Michelle had dragged her suitcase out of her house and into the attached garage of No. 1 Keithwood Court, it was after 1 a.m. in the very early morning of Friday, January 16th, and Michelle had said everything she needed to say to her killer. She had made her decision. It was just like she had told her closest friends. She was tired of the arguments, the guilt, and the demands. Still dressed in her black work outfit with the Chanel name tag pinned to her blouse, Michelle slipped off her shoes so she would make as little noise as possible. She could only hope that her children had not heard anything that had happened during the last 30 minutes since she'd arrived home from the Quaker Bridge Mall. Looking at the bulging suitcase, Michelle realized that getting it into the back seat of the Land Cruiser would take time that she didn't have. Better to leave it, so now, moving quickly, she stepped up to the driver's side of the car, opened that door, and climbed in behind the wheel. The garage was dark, except for the interior car light. The garage door was closed, and the overhead lights were not on. But before Michelle had time to close the driver's side door and turn on the car engine, her killer had suddenly stepped forward out of the gloom. And the nightmare that would later be detailed in the medical examiner's autopsy report was about to begin. Reaching in through the open car door, Michelle's killer grabbed her arm. Squeezing hard enough to leave a fingerprint pattern of bruises, the killer dragged the 100-pound woman out of the seat and threw her onto the floor. As Michelle tried to scramble back to her feet, the killer reached behind her and pulled a baseball bat from a nearby utility shelf. As Michelle turned to get away, her killer wound up and swung the bat with all their might, hitting Michelle squarely in the back of her skull. Falling to the floor of the garage, Michelle's head struck the running board of the Land Cruiser, leaving a dark splash of blood that dripped down onto the ground. Even though the medical examiner would later determine that the strike from the baseball bat had fractured Michelle's skull from the top of her eye socket to the base of her neck, at that point, the mother of three still gathered herself for a fight, trying to cover her face with her hands before turning over and dragging herself back to her feet. But Michelle, barefoot now except for her stockings, only made it a few steps towards the door before sliding in her own blood. As she started to go down onto her hands and knees, the killer came up on her from behind, and grabbing her shoulders, the killer immediately began to slam Michelle's face and head into the concrete floor of the garage again and again, only stopping after hearing what they later described as a sickening thud of smashed bone and cartilage. According to the medical examiner, Michelle's attempt to fight off her attacker had left her with cuts and bruises on her hands, wrists, and lips. The beating had not only cracked her skull, it had also caused significant internal organ damage, as well as bruising and injuries on her arms, hips, and elbows. But as Michelle's murderer slowly stood up, breathing hard and looking around the dim interior of the garage, the medical examiner would later estimate that it may have taken as much as 10 minutes before Michelle finally choked to death on her own blood. In that time, the killer thought through the next steps. Leaning down again to check for a pulse that was no longer there, a jolt of adrenaline surged through the killer. Gathering up Michelle's small body, the killer pushed her into the driver's seat of the Land Cruiser. Then the killer grabbed Michelle's blood-spattered suitcase, shoving it onto the back seat of the Toyota. Oblivious to the biting cold, at 2:15 a.m. on Friday morning, the killer circled the big green SUV and climbed into the passenger seat. Reaching over and starting up the engine, the killer gripped the steering wheel with one hand and used the other to click open the garage door. Then, awkwardly, making sure the headlights were turned off and using the long handle of an ice scraper to push the pedals of the accelerator and brake, the killer put the car into reverse and began backing out of the garage. Once the killer had enough room in the driveway to turn the car around, they immediately lost control of the vehicle, veering off the driveway and onto the front garden before finally coming to a stop back on the driveway. With the car now in park, the killer leaned over the center console and pushed the driver's seat back as far as it would go so there was more room to manipulate the floor controls with the handle of this ice scraper. Or, as police believe, for the killer to climb into the driver's seat and drive the car while sitting literally on the lap of Michelle's bloody and lifeless body. A few minutes later, the killer was driving slowly along the narrow, dark stretch of Jacobs Creek Road, looking for the white picket fence that was the one break in the guardrail that separated the road from the embankment leading down to Jacobs Creek. Once the killer saw the white wooden fence, they slowed, then steered the car so it broke and then ran over the fence. A moment later, and the big car had dropped gently down the 15-foot slope, passed through the middle of the small campsite, and broken the surface ice of the creek before the front wheels came to rest in 6 inches of water. 14 years earlier, when Michelle had met her future husband for the first time in person in the lobby of the Las Palmas Hotel, the one feature she had recognized from the photograph he had sent her of a much younger version of himself was his height. Now, after looking at his wife's dead body slumped over in the seat next to him, her right eye swollen shut, and the white bone of her skull showing through the cuts on her forehead, Jonathan Nice opened the passenger side of the family Land Cruiser and unfolded his heavy 6-foot 4-inch frame from the car as he stepped out onto the smooth expanse of unbroken snow. It was 3:15 a.m. Jonathan had been waiting for Michelle when she arrived home 2.5 hours earlier. As soon as her car had pulled into the garage, Jonathan had used the remote to close the garage door before beginning what was by now a familiar and vicious argument about Michelle's ongoing affair with Ennio. This time, though, Michelle didn't just tell her husband that she wanted a divorce, something she'd been saying for almost 5 months. This time, Michelle had walked into their bedroom, pulled out a suitcase, and begun packing to leave. For a long time now, Michelle had suspected that Jonathan had hired someone to follow her or was following her himself. Michelle had also come to believe, after finding a condom inside one of Jonathan's travel bags, that she wasn't the only one in this marriage who was being unfaithful. Now, Jonathan turned so he was facing the embankment, and wearing a pair of shoes he had constructed himself by gluing size 12 work boot soles onto the uppers of a pair of comfortable moccasins, he left the car and trudged through the snow back up to Jacobs Creek Road. From there, dressed in pajama bottoms and a t-shirt, he walked the mile back to the house on Keithwood Court, where he spent the next few hours covering his tracks. He dumped some of his bloody clothes and towels he'd used to clean the garage floor into the washing machine to soak, turning the water in the tub pink. He filled white plastic trash bags with the blood-soaked paper towels he also used to clean the floor and walls before spot painting areas of the garage to cover blood spatter. He stuffed his wet black PJ bottoms behind the couch and then used a saw to cut the soles of his shoes away from the moccasin uppers before cutting the soles into small pieces and hiding them throughout the house. And he left the baseball bat, still stained with Michelle's blood, on the storage shelf where he had grabbed it a few hours earlier. And then, Michelle's husband and killer went upstairs and crawled back into bed with his 3 kids and waited for the call that would tell him that Michelle had been killed in a tragic car accident out on Jacob Creek Road. It would turn out that from the moment Detective McEwen and his partner arrived at number 1 Keithwood Court on the morning that Michelle's body had been discovered and saw the crazy tire tracks in the snow on the Nice driveway, the detective had suspected that Jonathan Nice must be involved in Michelle's murder. Ever since meeting the Nice family back in July of 2003, the detective had been convinced that Jonathan's extortion claim against Ennio, along with Jonathan's claim that Ennio had threatened to hurt Michelle, were completely unfounded. And in conducting interviews back in the summer and again now that Michelle was dead, what he kept hearing from people close to Michelle was that Jonathan's lies about his age and his escalating attempts to control his younger wife, coupled with Michelle's resentment and restlessness, had turned the couple's marriage into a volatile stew of jealousy and, finally, uncontrolled rage. But despite these suspicions, it wasn't until Jonathan contradicted the formal statement he had given police that Detective McEwen had the grounds he needed to get a warrant that would allow police to search the Nice home for physical evidence that would tie Jonathan to his wife's murder. That moment came when Jonathan, riding with the detective back to the Nice home after Jonathan had sworn to police that the last time he had seen his wife was at 4 p.m. on Thursday afternoon, broke the silence inside the police car and told Detective McEwen somewhat offhandedly that until Jonathan and Michelle had fought later on the night when Michelle got back from work, Jonathan had really believed that the couple could make their marriage work. So, even as local police were out on Saturday tracking down and then interviewing Michelle's lover, Ennio, members of a special 13-member joint task force of state and local law enforcement, armed with a search warrant, were entering number 1 Keithwood Court, where, over the next 3 days, they would find one incriminating piece of evidence after another. On Sunday, January 18th, 2004, 2.5 days after the discovery of Michelle's body, Jonathan was brought into the Hopewell police station for a second interview, during which the 54-year-old scientist confessed to the murder of his 34-year-old wife. Jonathan would go on to say that he acted in self-defense after Michelle, who was 1 foot shorter than her husband and weighed 100 pounds compared to his 240 pounds, had threatened him with either a stiletto knife or the heel of one of her high-heeled shoes. The jury that found Jonathan Nice guilty of passion, provocation, manslaughter 19 months later did not buy that story, but they did reject the prosecution's claim that Michelle's death was premeditated. In September of 2005, Jonathan Nice was sentenced to 8 years in prison. 5 years later, he was released and returned to his kids, who had been placed in the care of Jonathan's brother and sister-in-law. In 2012, 8 years after Michelle's murder, Jonathan founded a successful new company that sold drugs claiming to cure the symptoms of cancer in dogs. But 8 years later, in one final twist to a story that had caused a national sensation back in 2004, a federal investigation proved that Jonathan's so-called cancer-curing drugs were a fraud, and that Jonathan's company was nothing more than a money-making scheme that had netted more than $1 million. And on Friday, December 23, 2022, 18 years after murdering his wife Michelle, Jonathan Nice was convicted by a federal grand jury of wire fraud and the interstate shipment of misbranded animal drugs. As of June 2023, the 73-year-old scientist now faces a large fine and up to 32 more years in prison. It was February 24, 1991, and Jennifer Jackson was at a hospital in St. Louis, Missouri. She was in labor, and she was about to give birth to her second child. And she was doing it alone. Her boyfriend, and the father of this child, Brian Stewart, was an Army medic, and currently he was deployed to the Middle East, so he couldn't be there for the birth. Brian was heartbroken that he couldn't be there for this big moment. He was so excited to become a dad. Before leaving for this deployment, he'd given Jennifer a framed poem he had written about becoming a parent. And whenever they spoke on the phone, Brian couldn't wait to hear about Jennifer's latest ultrasound and how big the baby was getting. And through it all, Brian had just one request about the baby boy who would be born while he was overseas. He wanted Jennifer to name this child after him. Brian knew that there was a chance he could be killed in action, and so he wanted to guarantee that this baby always had a connection to their father. Just then, a huge, painful contraction brought Jennifer back into the present, and her doctor told her, "Come on, one more push, just one more push." And a few minutes later, Jennifer was holding a screaming little baby boy, Brian Jr., in her arms. 9 months later, on Christmas morning, Jennifer sat on the couch, helping baby Brian open his presents, while Brian Sr. sat next to them, sipping coffee. Jennifer looked over at him and squeezed his leg. Ever since coming home a few months ago, Brian had been this amazing father and partner. He did what he could to help with the baby, and he was extremely attentive to Jennifer's needs. He loved to hold her hand and talk about their future together. But Jennifer felt like she was still getting to know Brian. They hadn't been dating that long before she got pregnant and he went off to war. So when he sometimes got moody and walked out in a huff, Jennifer didn't really know what to think. But with Brian's charming smile and good looks, Jennifer could never stay mad at him for very long. And after all, he did always come back, which was more than she could say for her previous boyfriends. The father of her first child was hardly in her young daughter's life at all. But on this particular morning, their first Christmas together as a family, Brian began acting pretty strangely. When Jennifer handed him a present for the baby and asked Brian Sr. to help open it, Brian Sr. refused. And then a dark expression came over his face and he got up off the couch and began pacing. Jennifer had no idea what he was doing, and at first she thought, maybe he's having a flashback from his time in the Middle East. And so she asked Brian, hey, are you okay? But Brian just kept on pacing. And then at some point, Brian came to a stop, he took a deep breath and looked Jennifer in the eye and said, "I don't think I'm Brian Jr.'s father." Jennifer was totally stunned. She asked Brian where this was coming from. Then she held the baby up and asked how could he believe this child was anyone else's but his. The baby looked just like Brian Sr. But Brian Sr. refused to listen, and he ultimately stormed out of the room, shouting that he knew the truth and was not going to raise another man's child. Jennifer didn't know what to do. She wanted to follow after him to their bedroom and get him to calm down, but Brian seemed so angry, she didn't know how he'd react if she just kept on insisting the baby really was his. So she just hung back and tried her best to comfort Brian Jr. while Brian Sr. packed a bag and left the house. About 2 months later, Jennifer was at home, balancing her son on her hip while she tried to cook some lunch for him and his sister. Adjusting to life as a single mother had been very challenging for Jennifer, and she wasn't getting much help from anybody else in her family either. Jennifer's sister was around a lot, but she was also a drug addict. And so a lot of the times when Jennifer's sister came over, she'd come over with a friend or two and they were high on heroin. Sometimes Jennifer even caught her sister and her friends injecting drugs in her house. Jennifer hated all the substance abuse around her kids, but at the same time, she just didn't have the heart to stop her sister from coming around because it meant a lot to her sister to visit the kids. Every now and again, Jennifer would try calling Brian for help, but whenever he actually answered the phone, he would just yell at her about how Brian Jr. was not his son. Jennifer did her best not to let it bother her and just focused on trying to raise her kids as best as she could. But as Jennifer cooked up some mac and cheese, she noticed little Brian's breathing suddenly sounded different. He was wheezing and it seemed like he was having a hard time catching his breath. Jennifer had no idea what was going on, but just from the looks of it, this didn't look like a common cold or something else that was easy to explain. This looked pretty serious. And so as her little boy continued to struggle to breathe, Jennifer just picked up her phone, called her mom, and told her to meet her at the hospital. Then Jennifer bundled up her kids and drove to the nearest emergency room. A few hours later, Jennifer was sitting beside little Brian's crib at St. Joseph's West Hospital in Lake St. Louis. The baby was hooked up to an IV, as well as all sorts of monitors that measured his vitals. Thankfully, though, he was now breathing normally. Little Brian's pediatrician, Dr. Linda Steele Green, was treating the baby for pneumonia and asthma, a chronic disease that can make breathing difficult. The doctor explained that Brian Jr. had an asthma attack, but she had given him some treatments to stabilize him. For Jennifer, this diagnosis was both relieving and kind of daunting. She now knew baby Brian would be okay, but asthma was a condition that her son would have to live with for the rest of his life. Jennifer thought about the baby's father, Brian Sr. Even though he had not been involved in his son's life since he moved out, Jennifer figured she should let him know what was going on. So she used the hospital room's phone to call another hospital where Brian Sr. worked as a lab tech. A few moments later, one of Brian's colleagues answered the call, and Jennifer told them to please find Brian Stewart because his son was at St. Joseph's Hospital. But the person on the other end sounded confused. They asked Jennifer if she was maybe looking for a different Brian Stewart, because the Brian Stewart that worked there had never said anything about having a son. Jennifer almost slammed the phone down in anger. She knew Brian was in denial about being little Brian's father, but this was just disgraceful. Trying to stay calm, she assured the colleague that, oh yes, she had the right Brian Stewart and to please relay this message as soon as possible. After Jennifer hung up, she did her best to put Brian Sr. out of her mind. For now, the only thing that mattered was her baby boy getting better. The next morning, Jennifer was leaning over the edge of little Brian's hospital crib as he slept, holding his hand. The breathing treatments were working, and once the baby woke up, the doctor said he was well enough to go home. Jennifer got up to go pack some things when she suddenly heard someone walk through the door. She turned around, and much to her surprise, Brian Sr. was standing there with his white lab coat folded over his arm. He said he was there to see the baby. Jennifer was definitely surprised to see him. She didn't really know how she felt about it, but at the same time, she was grateful that her ex-boyfriend obviously cared enough about their son that he was here now to visit him in the hospital. Brian Sr. placed his lab coat down on a chair and then walked over to Jennifer and gently took Brian Jr. from her arms. Brian Sr. smiled at the baby and then said to Jennifer that she should take a break and grab a snack. Jennifer smiled and took him up on the offer and headed down to the hospital cafeteria. About 20 minutes later, Jennifer was done with her break, so she stepped back into the elevator and rode it upstairs towards the pediatric floor. When the elevator doors opened, Jennifer heard the unmistakable sound of her own child screaming, and so Jennifer took off running towards her son's room. Once she got there, she found Brian Sr. sitting in a rocking chair, looking terrified and very confused. He was holding little Brian in his arms. The baby was sobbing. Jennifer tried to run over and grab her son, but before she could, nurses rushed in and put little Brian back in his bed and began taking his vitals. They said his blood pressure and pulse were much higher than normal. A moment later, little Brian's pediatrician, Dr. Steele Green, came in to examine him. Jennifer stood off to the side, biting her nails nervously. Finally, after doing the exam, Dr. Steele Green told Jennifer that she couldn't explain why little Brian's vital signs were so off. He was stable now, but whatever had just happened definitely was not an asthma attack. So a decision was made to keep Brian Jr. in the hospital for further observation instead of discharging him like they'd planned. Jennifer turned to Brian Sr. and asked him what happened while she was gone. He just shrugged. He said everything was going fine, Brian Jr. seemed perfectly happy, and then all of a sudden, he was just crying his lungs out. Jennifer asked Brian Sr. if he wanted to stay a bit longer, but he just shook his head and said no. He said he had a lot to do and that he wouldn't be much help here anyway. Then he picked up his lab coat, and after waving goodbye to the baby, he left Jennifer alone to comfort their son. Jennifer stayed in the room with Brian Jr. for the next few days, as doctors continued to monitor his progress. Finally, Dr. Steele Green said it was safe for them to go home now. As Jennifer strapped her son into a stroller, the pediatrician told her to look out for asthma symptoms. But beyond that, her baby boy should be just fine. 4 years later, in the spring of 1996, Jennifer ran a bath for Brian Jr., who was now 5 years old. After the frightening hospital visit when he was an infant, Brian's childhood had actually gone as normally as it could. But he hadn't actually seen his father again since that hospital visit. Brian Sr. continued to deny that he was the child's father, and he very clearly did not want to be involved in this baby's life anyway. Jennifer thought ultimately it was for the best. It was Brian Sr.'s loss. Jennifer and Brian Jr. were getting along just fine by themselves. Once the bath was ready, Jennifer squirted some soap on a washcloth and began to get Brian cleaned up. But as she scrubbed him, she noticed something strange. They'd gone to the park earlier, and Brian had gotten a couple of scrapes and cuts like all kids do, but they looked really red and swollen. And some fresh mosquito bites that he had gotten at the park looked huge and inflamed. It was like his body was not properly healing itself. Jennifer helped her son out of the bath and put some bandages on his wounds, and as they walked to his room to get ready for bed, Jennifer noticed Brian Jr. was now walking strangely, like he was having trouble keeping his balance. Jennifer held her son's hands to try to help him walk, and she noticed his palms felt clammy. So Jennifer took his temperature, and she was shocked to see the thermometer read 105 degrees. Even though Brian Jr. had just been in the bath, Jennifer knew Brian's body temperature should not be this high. This was a potentially lethal fever, and he needed medical attention right away. Once they arrived at the hospital, little Brian was taken straight to the pediatric intensive care unit. Jennifer did her best not to panic, as a team of doctors, including Dr. Steele Green, hooked up Brian Jr. to a bunch of monitors and stuck needles in his arms for IVs and blood tests. It was nerve-wracking, but Jennifer was glad that Dr. Steele Green was there. The two women had become friends after Brian Jr.'s hospital stay when he was a baby, and Dr. Steele Green had continued to see the boy for regular pediatric appointments. Jennifer was very confident that Dr. Steele Green would be able to help her son. By the end of the day, little Brian had been stabilized, but the doctors still didn't know what was wrong with him. Dr. Steele Green promised Jennifer she would run every test she could, and hopefully they would have an answer in the morning. That night, Jennifer lay awake on the couch inside of little Brian's hospital room, listening to her son's heart monitor beeping. Jennifer had been trying to stay optimistic, but it was now clear that little Brian was seriously ill. But still, Jennifer knew that Dr. Steele Green would do everything she could to figure out what was wrong. Just as Jennifer was beginning to fall asleep, little Brian suddenly shot up in bed, crying and screaming for his mother. Jennifer rushed over to him and tried to calm him down, but he just kept on sobbing and begging his mother not to let him die. Jennifer promised her son that he'd be okay. The doctors would figure out what was wrong with him, and they would fix it. She said this over and over again and held her son close until finally little Brian did drift back to sleep. A few days later, Jennifer sat beside little Brian's hospital bed, gripping his hand as he slept. Ever since he'd been admitted, Jennifer had barely left her son's side. Little Brian was in extremely bad shape, and Jennifer didn't want to be away from him in case something really bad happened. Over the past few days, little Brian had grown weaker and weaker as his organs began to shut down one by one. His skin had grown jaundiced and yellow because his liver and spleen were not working properly, his ears were infected, and his digestive system had almost entirely shut down. And the doctors really had no idea why any of this was happening. They had tested little Brian for everything they could think of, even diseases that had been largely eradicated or only existed in other countries. Everything had come back negative. As Jennifer went down her mental checklist of all little Brian's symptoms, trying to come up with some explanation that kind of made sense, she heard a knock at the door. Dr. Steele Green opened it up and stood in the doorway with a very somber look on her face. She walked in and took a seat in a chair next to Jennifer. Jennifer could see tears forming in the doctor's eyes, and a pit began to form in Jennifer's stomach. She knew that whatever news Dr. Steele Green had, it would not be good. In a quiet voice, Dr. Steele Green told Jennifer they had finally figured out what was wrong with little Brian. It was something so unlikely, she would have probably never figured it out on her own. The only reason she'd even thought to test for it was because the possibility came to her in a nightmare. As she slept, a series of frightening images came into her mind. She saw blood, then she saw needles and test tubes, then she heard the squeak of a rocking chair and the sound of a baby crying. Then she was wide awake, sitting upright in her bed, finally having an idea of what might be wrong with little Brian. Normally, she wouldn't follow her dreams for medical advice, but Dr. Steele Green had been out of ideas, and she was willing to try anything at this point. So they had gone ahead and tested Brian for this really specific, terrible disease, and it would turn out the doctor's nightmare diagnosis was correct. Brian tested positive. Now there was no more sugarcoating. Little Brian didn't have long to live. Because he'd just tested positive for the HIV virus, and it had turned into full-blown AIDS at a time when there was basically no treatments for the disease. HIV can prevent the body from fighting off even the slightest infection. The disease that the virus causes is called AIDS, and 30 years ago, it was an absolute death sentence. Dr. Steele Green estimated Brian had maybe 5 months left to live. Jennifer was absolutely speechless. Panic raced through her mind as she wondered how this could have happened. Jennifer didn't know much about HIV, but from what she did know, you got it from having sex with someone who had HIV, or you got it from sharing contaminated needles. But of course, Brian was doing neither of those things because he was 5 years old. But then Jennifer's mind went to a dark place. Her thoughts turned to her sister, who was a heroin addict, who still sometimes used drugs in their house. Jennifer had done her best to keep Brian away from her sister when she was doing that, but she wondered if somehow maybe he'd gotten poked with an HIV-infected needle when she wasn't paying attention. Or, much, much worse, maybe a stranger who was infected with HIV had done the unspeakable and sexually abused her son. Jennifer looked over at her son and just began to cry. Her children were absolutely everything to her. And so for now, Jennifer knew she had to focus on just finding a way to keep her son alive. So she turned to Dr. Steele Green and told her that she was willing to do whatever it took to help Brian. 2 years later, Jennifer stood in her kitchen helping her son, Brian Jr., wiggle into a special backpack. Brian was miraculously still alive, but just barely. This special backpack he was wearing was connected to a feeding tube that led into little Brian's stomach. He needed a liquid diet to survive because he basically always vomited if he ate solid food. But both Jennifer and Brian agreed that it was a worthy trade-off because he'd beaten all expectations and lived long past the 5 months his doctors had estimated. But it wasn't easy to get by. Because Brian required so much help every single day, Jennifer had been forced to quit her job. And because her ex-boyfriend, Brian Sr., still wouldn't send child support payments, Jennifer and her kids had to live off of food stamps and other welfare programs. And just from a medical perspective, it took a lot of work for Brian just to make it through each day. After getting his backpack secured, Jennifer walked over to the cabinet and pulled out a massive medication tray. She carefully doled out 23 different pills for Brian to take. Once Brian had taken all of his medications, Jennifer took him by the hand and they went outside to wait for the school bus. Because there was still so much fear around AIDS, little Brian was not allowed to ride on the standard school bus with most of the other kids. Instead, he had to ride on another bus for children with special needs. Jennifer's heart broke just thinking about the bullying Brian had to endure at school. Bullies called him all sorts of names, and they mocked him for the bulky hearing aids he now had to wear all the time after losing 80% of his hearing. But through it all, Brian remained relentlessly optimistic. Jennifer was so proud of his ability to remain positive despite all the suffering he'd endured, and so Jennifer did her best to not let her own fears and her own anxieties get in the way of her son's childhood. Now, just keeping her son alive basically consumed all of Jennifer's waking hours. But she also had one other major concern about her son, figuring out how he'd actually been infected with the HIV virus in the first place. A few minutes later, the bus pulled up in front of their house. Jennifer hugged her son goodbye, and then he climbed on board the bus and the bus took off, and then Jennifer went back inside her home. After she got dressed, she called Detective Kevin Wilson down at the St. Charles County Sheriff's Office. For the past 2 years, Detective Wilson had worked tirelessly to try to figure out how Brian had gotten HIV. The detective had tested the blood of at least 30 people who had spent time with Brian Jr., including Jennifer's sister and her friends, but none of them had been HIV positive, so this very likely ruled out transmission from drugs. The detective had also found no indication that little Brian had ever been sexually abused by anyone, so it was highly unlikely he got HIV that way either. But there was one lead that Detective Wilson was still working on, and that was what Jennifer was calling him about today. Detective Wilson assured her that he was close to cracking the case, but there were still some loose ends to tie up. This was a delicate situation, and he had to be absolutely sure he was right before he made his move. Before they hung up, Detective Wilson promised Jennifer that little Brian would get the justice he deserved. A few months later, in December of 1998, Jennifer sat down in the witness stand at the front of a St. Louis County courtroom. Her hands shook as she looked to her right at the judge. Right out in front of her, she saw there were news reporters, jury members, and at the defendant's table, her ex-boyfriend, Brian Stewart. He stared at her with cold, hateful eyes. Jennifer swore to tell the truth, and then took a deep breath. Speaking into a small microphone, she explained that she broke up with Brian Sr. in 1991. She said they fought bitterly over child support payments, and at one point, Brian even threatened her. Brian insisted that Brian Jr. was not his son, and Jennifer should stop asking him to give her money, because, after all, Brian Jr. wouldn't even live past the age of 5. Jennifer testified that way back when little Brian was first treated for asthma, his father showed up at the hospital totally unannounced and convinced her to leave the room to go on a break. And when she came back from that break, their son was screaming. Brian Sr. had left quickly, and that was the last time he ever saw his son. Little Brian seemed okay for the next 4 years, until he suddenly developed confusing and terrifying medical problems. Jennifer's voice broke as she recounted all the painful memories. The prosecuting attorney thanked her, and she stepped down from the witness stand. Then the attorney turned to the jury and explained that the answer to this mystery could be found in one place: Brian Sr.'s job. Brian Sr. worked as a hospital lab technician who was responsible for drawing blood from patients. He had access to tons of blood samples, including blood from people who are sick with infectious diseases. Brian Sr.'s work was the missing puzzle piece. With it, the prosecution could explain exactly what happened to little Brian. It went like this. Brian Stewart was an abusive boyfriend who never wanted to be a father, even though he pretended to be very enthusiastic at first. Once he moved out, he was angry over child support payments, so he hatched a plan to make them go away. On the day that 11-month-old little Brian Jr. was supposed to leave the hospital, Brian Sr. showed up carrying his lab coat. Inside his coat pocket was a vial of blood he'd stolen from the phlebotomy lab where he worked. He told Jennifer to go take a break and he would watch the baby, and then while she was gone, he used a tiny butterfly needle to inject his infant son with that contaminated blood, hoping it would eventually kill the baby. That blood came from a patient who was obviously HIV positive. So for the next 4 years, little Brian lived with the HIV virus in his body until it transformed into full-blown AIDS. And by the time the doctors figured out what was happening, the disease had already progressed, seemingly beyond hope. Ultimately, Brian Sr. would be sentenced to life in prison. The story of what he'd done to his own baby son made international news. People were absolutely horrified, but they were also inspired by Brian Jr.'s resilience. In the years following the trial, Brian Jr. continued beating the odds. He made it through elementary and middle school. At 13, he began to find comfort in Christianity, which he said allowed him to forgive his father. Incredibly, Brian Jr. is still alive today. His diagnosis seemed like a death sentence in 1996, but with new scientific advancements, today, AIDS is actually a fairly treatable disease. Brian Jr. now works as a motivational speaker, and he runs a nonprofit called Hope is Vital that aims to reduce discrimination against those living with HIV and AIDS. In early September of 1977, 26-year-old Lois Gibbs held her son's hand as they left their house in Niagara Falls, New York. Michael was just 5 years old, and it was his first day of kindergarten, and as soon as they reached the front steps of the house, Michael broke free from his mother and ran across the front yard. Lois smiled at her son's enthusiasm as she adjusted her oversized glasses and tucked her brown hair behind her ears. Michael's father was already at work, so it was just the two of them walking the few short blocks to 99th Street Elementary School. And as they walked through the neighborhood, Michael looked up at all the smokestacks that dotted the landscape. He pointed out one of them and proudly exclaimed to his mother that that's where Daddy was. Lois smiled at her son and nodded. Niagara Falls was a big blue-collar city full of factories like those, and they were where most local people were employed, which included Lois's husband, who worked at the local Goodyear tire plant. It was hard work, and Lois appreciated everything he did for their family, even if he always came home smelling absolutely terrible. As Lois and Michael continued their walk to school, a neighbor who was out on their front porch called out hello and asked if the little boy was excited to be starting school. Lois knew this woman. She had a son the same age as Michael, but the best answer she could muster to this neighbor was just a nod and a smile, and then immediately Lois looked down and began fiddling with her necklace, which was something she did whenever she felt anxious. Truthfully, Michael was very excited about school, but his mother was just a little bit nervous to let him go. Michael was an active kid, but he was kind of fragile. He had asthma and a history of pneumonia and painful urinary tract infections, and these infections really made Lois feel helpless because she actually could not give Michael any medicine. Aspirin upset his stomach, and he broke out in a rash whenever he took it. Now, Michael was starting school, and Lois worried about all the new viruses and germs he'd be exposed to. Lois's neighbor continued to talk from her porch, and Lois tried to focus on what she was saying, something about the kids playing baseball that weekend, but her anxiety made it really hard to concentrate. And so Lois's mind wandered, and so did her eyes. And as she looked around, she saw kids running up the front steps of the school, and she noticed a man standing nearby the school with a few of the teachers, writing something down on a notepad and asking questions. Lois pointed at this man and actually asked the neighbor on the porch if they knew who this guy was. The neighbor glanced over and told Lois that that guy was a reporter for the local newspaper, which was called the Niagara Gazette. The neighbor guessed that the journalist was there to cover the first day of school. Lois nodded, but then also made a mental note to make sure she totally avoided him. He seemed perfectly friendly, but the thought of talking to a reporter made her extremely nervous. Lois waved goodbye to the neighbor and then watched as her son ran ahead to join the other children. Lois felt a mix of excitement and apprehension. Grabbing her necklace tight, she told herself everything would be fine, and then she turned and headed home. A few weeks later, Lois was at home with her sewing machine on the kitchen table, and Michael was at school. Lois was stitching some new drapes for the kitchen window when the phone rang. Lois rolled her eyes, annoyed at having to stop when she was right in the middle of a seam, but she got up and went over and answered the phone. It was the school nurse calling, saying that Michael was lying on her bed in her office. During recess, Michael had become glassy-eyed and unresponsive for just a few seconds, and he seemed to be fine now, but the nurse suspected he likely had a small seizure. Lois's breathing immediately quickened as she asked the nurse to please repeat that. The nurse reassured Lois that while it was scary that he had a seizure, the seizure was short, and Michael was totally back to his normal self now. Still, the nurse suggested that Lois come and get her son and take him to his pediatrician as soon as possible. Lois could feel her heart racing as she slammed the phone on the receiver and then fumbled with her shoes as she raced out her front door. After getting to the school and picking Michael up, Lois took him straight to see the doctor. The doctor gave him a thorough examination and promised Lois that Michael's vitals did look fine and he was not in any sort of imminent danger. He said that while it was rare, kids could sometimes have minor seizures with no obvious cause. But if this happened again, he did advise Lois to take Michael to a specialist. Lois was glad to hear that her son was okay, but she was still very nervous. She already had to monitor Michael's fragile health, and now she had to also watch out for these seizures too. She just hoped that it really was a one-time thing and that this would not become a recurring issue. But unfortunately, the seizures didn't stop. Over the next few months, Lois would learn to recognize when they were happening. There didn't seem to be any particular trigger for them. Michael might be playing in the backyard or doing his homework or watching TV, when all of a sudden his eyes would just kind of glaze over and he would become unresponsive for a few seconds. Then, as if nothing had happened, he'd just be right back to normal. Every time it happened, Lois rushed to Michael's side, holding his hand and reassuring him that everything was okay. But inside, she was terrified. She knew it was only a matter of time until Michael's seizures actually caused a major problem. He could be playing on the jungle gym and have a seizure and fall and get hurt, or he could be crossing the street and have a seizure and then get hit by a car. And so finally, when it became fairly obvious to everybody involved that these seizures were likely not going away anytime soon, Michael's pediatrician referred Lois to a neurologist. Lois finally got Michael an appointment in December of 1977, about 3 months after Michael had his first seizure. Lois gave the neurologist a detailed history of Michael's various seizures, and the doctor quickly diagnosed him with epilepsy, a brain disorder that causes chronic seizures. Even though Lois had been expecting something like this, she was still stunned to hear it. There was no family history of epilepsy. Michael had never experienced any kind of physical trauma that might trigger seizures. She'd always fed her family a healthy and nutritious diet. She didn't even allow soda in the house. And so finally, Lois asked the neurologist, what could I have done differently that could have protected my son from this? But the doctor assured Lois that Michael's diagnosis was not her fault. He said epilepsy can have many causes, ranging from a past brain infection to a genetic abnormality. But while this was somewhat reassuring, it didn't really actually clarify for Lois why her son developed epilepsy. To her, it just didn't add up. After the appointment, Lois drove to the pharmacy and picked up the anti-seizure medication the specialist had prescribed. As she did, she still couldn't believe this was actually happening. 2 months later, in February of 1978, Michael and Lois were back inside of a doctor's office. This time, it was Michael's pediatrician. Lois tried to entertain Michael by playing the game I Spy with him, but Michael just sat on the exam table looking pale and very tired. In fact, Lois had never seen Michael so tired and run down before. When the pediatrician finally came into the room, he examined Michael and told Lois that she was right to be concerned. Anti-seizure medication could lower a child's energy levels, but Michael shouldn't be this out of it. The doctor ordered a full battery of blood tests, then sent Lois and Michael home, promising to call them with the results as soon as they came in. And a few hours later, the pediatrician would call Lois, and as soon as she picked up, he would say that unfortunately he had bad news. He told Lois that Michael's white blood cell count had dropped significantly, so much so that the pediatrician hadn't even known what to do and had to go to a colleague to ask for their advice. And so from what he learned, he told Lois that Michael's medication could be what's causing this drop, but he also said that they needed to prepare for another darker possibility. The doctor explained that Michael might be developing cancer or perhaps a serious blood disorder. When Lois heard this, she just stood there, frozen in the kitchen. It was like time suddenly was standing still. And for a few moments, Lois just didn't say anything. She just stood there. But then finally, she collected herself enough to ask the doctor how they would know for sure what this was. The pediatrician sighed and said unfortunately he did not have the answer, and that Michael would have to be referred to more specialists to get to an answer. As the pediatrician talked, Lois found herself walking over to the kitchen doorway, and she looked in on Michael, who was fast asleep on the couch. He looked so helpless, and she had no idea what to do. At a loss, Lois thanked the pediatrician for all his help so far, then she hung up the phone in a haze. At the same time that Lois was receiving this devastating news, a 26-year-old reporter named Mike Brown stood in the driveway of a wood and brick ranch-style home a couple of blocks away, and as he stood there, he rubbed his hands together to keep them warm against the winter cold. Mike grew up in the area, so he knew a lot about Niagara Falls and the people who lived in this town. And as a rookie reporter with the Niagara Gazette, he was more than willing to go door to door, asking his neighbors for leads on the stories he was investigating. He liked proving himself. Today, Mike was investigating reports of water backing up into people's backyards, even when it wasn't raining. One of Mike's sources said the city had done a lousy job at maintaining sewer pipes, and so they were starting to get clogged. This sort of negligence really got under Mike's skin. Mike strode up the driveway of the ranch home and knocked on the door, and then waited until a petite woman answered the door. Mike introduced himself and explained that he was hoping she could help him. As soon as Mike brought up what he was investigating, reports of water backups, the woman just shook her head in disgust and then invited Mike to follow her into her backyard. Mike followed, thrilled to finally get a lead on this story. He'd been knocking on doors all morning without any luck. It was midwinter, so Mike did not expect to see standing water anywhere because there was too much snow on the ground. But this woman's yard looked like a frozen-over mud pit. The woman told Mike that this was totally typical, that for years her yard had been coated in muck, and in the winter it turned to ice. Mike couldn't imagine how upset he'd be if his own backyard was this bad. Then the woman pointed over to a large circular hole right in the middle of the yard. She explained that they used to have an above-ground swimming pool that was located right there. But a few summers ago, there had been so much standing water coming into the yard that the pool actually began to float. So she and her husband decided to replace the above-ground pool with a cement one. But when they dug the hole for it, the hole had filled up with rancid-smelling yellow, blue, and purple liquids. And so at that point, they decided to just stop with the pool, and they did not end up building one. Mike asked the woman if he could take a few pictures, and she said that was fine, and so he pulled out a small camera and snapped a few photos of the yard, just so he'd remember it later on when he was back in the office. Then he thanked the woman for showing him the yard and said he would be in touch. After that, Mike grabbed a quick sandwich from the nearby gas station and then wolfed it down in his car while he looked over his notes. He had originally thought he'd be researching a story about bad drainage, but as he looked at his notes, he was beginning to think that maybe the problem here was bigger than that. He was certain that the strange, stinking liquid the woman talked about could not be normal flooding, but he would need to talk to more people to figure out what was actually going on. Half an hour later, Mike was back to knocking on doors around 99th Street. After trying a few houses, he finally connected with a middle-aged couple who, after hearing what Mike was researching, said they'd be happy to talk to him. The moment Mike entered their house, he could smell mold, but it wasn't the normal smell of mildew. There was something stale and sort of plasticky about it. A little alarm bell began ringing in the back of Mike's head. Something was really wrong here. The husband, who was tall and had a beer belly, said he wanted to bring Mike down into the basement. But as soon as the husband opened up the door that led to the basement steps, the smell coming out of the basement was this horrible, rancid, wet smell that burned Mike's nose. Mike wondered if maybe this was the same smell that the petite woman he had spoken to at the other house smelled at the bottom of that hole in her yard. The husband and Mike began descending the stairs, but about halfway down, the husband stopped and just told Mike to look around. And so Mike would look around the basement, and right away he saw all this thick black sludge seeping in through the walls of the basement and kind of collecting in the corners on the floor. Mike asked the husband how long their basement had been like this, and the man said, they'd been trying to dry the basement out for about 20 years now. The husband said they had tried everything they could to clear out the sludge, but nothing had worked. The husband also said he called the city countless times to try to get them to help him, but he said nobody from the city ever called him back. This really upset Mike. This couple's living in a house full of this terrible smell and sludge for years and years, and the city had just ignored them. It was becoming clear to Mike that this neighborhood around 99th Street had a problem, and this story was definitely going to be a lot bigger than just a drainage issue. After thanking the couple for their time, Mike headed back outside, looking forward to take a deep breath of fresh air. But when he stepped out onto the stoop, the smell of mold he had smelled inside the house was now replaced with a different sour smell. He scrunched his nose up and pulled his shirt collar up to his eyes and covered his mouth with his hand. As he approached the 99th Street Elementary School playground, he could taste the sour chemical-like smell in his mouth. It made his throat sting, which made it hard to breathe, and by the time he reached the playground, Mike was actually wheezing from this sour smell. And that's when he looked out over the school playground and saw several pools of what looked like oil on the ground. Yet school was in session. He could see lights on in all the classrooms as though nothing was wrong. At this point, Mike was furious. It seemed obvious to him that something dangerous was going on here, and the city was clearly ignoring it. Mike turned on his heels and rushed back towards his car, anxious to get back to his office and start writing about what he was finding. A few weeks later, in April of 1978, Lois Gibbs, whose son Michael was epileptic and still very sick, anxiously stood in the school superintendent's office. She was clutching a few of Mike Brown's newspaper articles that had just come out that week in the Niagara Gazette. The articles explained that there were all these horrible smelling liquids that were collecting all around the neighborhood right around the elementary school, and so Lois was worried these liquids were what was making her son sick. Despite her natural shyness, Lois had actually called a meeting to talk over the situation with the superintendent. Lois slid the articles to the superintendent across his shiny oak desk, and she told him about her son's health issues. Even though Michael's health had stabilized and the doctors concluded he did not have cancer, he still wasn't getting better. And so after reading Mike Brown's articles, Lois had become convinced that these black sludge pools at the school must have something to do with her son's illness. Lois told the superintendent that she did not feel safe having Michael on school grounds until these black pools could be investigated by specialists. With tears welling in her eyes, she said that she was worried Michael was going to die. She wanted him transferred out of the school immediately. Across from her, the superintendent kind of dramatically leaned back in his oversized leather chair, and then a look of forced empathy came across his face. And this look kind of unnerved Lois, and she began fiddling with her necklace again, but she pressed on. She pushed 2 doctor's notes across the desk, trying to look self-assured. The superintendent looked at her, and then looked at the notes, and then his look of empathy disappeared, and his eyes narrowed as he told Lois that she was definitely overreacting. All the other students were just fine. The articles were mistaken. There was nothing wrong with the school. Lois tried to stay calm, and so in a sort of shaky but somewhat even voice, she told the superintendent that he was being way too casual with the health of the students at 99th Street Elementary School. But the superintendent just shook his head. No, that was not true. Then he slid the doctor's notes back across the desk and pointed his finger accusingly at Lois. He told her that he wasn't about to upend the whole school for one sick kid and a hysterical housewife. The words felt like a slap in the face to Lois. She didn't understand how anyone working in education could be so heartless, and so she grabbed her purse and stormed out of the room. As she drove home after the meeting, Lois felt shell-shocked, her thoughts flipping back and forth between rage and helplessness. But by the time she pulled into her driveway, she knew what she was going to do. Lois was going to reach out to other parents and let them know what was going on. Maybe she'd even tell the whole neighborhood. Heck, she'd go door to door if she had to. If she couldn't get her son transferred out of that school, well, then she was going to have that school shut down before any more children got sick. The next morning, Lois felt butterflies in her stomach as she walked down her driveway. In her hands was a pencil and a petition demanding that the school be shut down. Lois walked all the way to the end of the street, figuring she could work her way back up the street towards home in time for lunch. Lois couldn't keep herself from shaking as she forced herself up onto a neighbor's stoop and knocked on their door. She almost hoped that nobody would answer, but she needed her neighbors to be home, and she needed them to listen. Lois could hear footsteps inside the house, and soon a kind-looking woman about her own age answered the door. Lois smiled and then very anxiously launched into this shaky explanation of what she was doing here, telling the woman about her son and the pools of black liquid on the schoolyard. As Lois spoke, the woman stayed quiet. To Lois, it seemed like this woman might be annoyed with her, and so this made Lois even more nervous, and she began to speak even faster, and then when she was done, the woman just stayed quiet. Lois was convinced this woman would call her crazy and slam the door in her face, but then the woman told Lois that she also had a kid at 99th Street Elementary, a little girl who was diagnosed with arthritis at a very young age. The woman and her husband couldn't understand how their daughter could have arthritis as a little kid, and they'd spent countless hours talking over different possibilities. But now, the woman told Lois she wondered if maybe their children's medical cases could be related. Lois felt a combination of pride and sadness as the woman took the clipboard and signed the petition. After that, Lois thanked the woman profusely and let this small glimmer of success boost her confidence as she headed to the next house. A few houses down, another woman came to the door. This time it was someone who was a bit older than Lois, and this woman would tell Lois that her own daughter, who was in her 20s, had recently had a miscarriage, and the daughter's seemingly healthy young husband had had a fatal heart attack soon after the miscarriage. And so the older woman did not need much convincing to also sign Lois's petition. By the time Lois was just halfway down the street, her petition was completely full of signatures. And so Lois was more convinced than ever that there was something wrong with this neighborhood and it needed to be stopped. A few months after Lois got her petition signed by basically everybody in the neighborhood, reporter Mike Brown waited behind one of the trees just outside of City Hall. He'd done this every morning since early April, and now it was almost summer. As Mike sipped his morning coffee and enjoyed the warmth of the morning sun on his face, he noticed the mayor walking from the parking lot to the front steps of City Hall, and so Mike headed over to cut him off. Like he'd done on many mornings before this, Mike started pelting the mayor with questions about the sludge puddles around 99th Elementary School and the oozing basements and flooded backyards that he documented that spring. And as always, the mayor told Mike that all those issues were just a nuisance and not serious health problems, and then the mayor ducked inside his office at City Hall where Mike could no longer follow him. Mike had expected the morning to go this way. He just wanted to annoy the mayor and keep the issue in front of him. Maybe if he badgered the mayor enough, the man would slip up, or maybe finally agree to actually talk about these issues. After ambushing the mayor, Mike walked across the street from City Hall to a diner. He walked in through the front door and took a seat at the bar, breathing in the smell of fresh pancakes. A waitress was working the register. She asked Mike if he'd like the usual, and Mike said yes. The waitress brought him a fresh cup of coffee. Then, as usual, she moved the phone from behind the counter to within reach of Mike. Mike thanked her, then used the phone to dial the Niagara County Health Department. At this point, he knew the number by heart. A familiar voice picked up on the other line. Mike didn't know the receptionist by name, but after months of calling and calling, he certainly recognized her voice, and she knew it was Mike immediately. She wished him good luck and then transferred him to her boss before he even had to ask. And as usual, her boss, the health department official who answered the phone, told Mike that the smell and the collecting pools of black liquid were not a health concern. To Mike, it just seemed like the mayor and the health department were in cahoots. Mike hung up and dialed another number. This time it was for the Hooker Chemical Company, which was an industrial company that used to own the land that was adjacent to 99th Street. Mike had already approached Hooker Chemical through more formal channels, and company officials always told him that the black ooze flooding yards all over the neighborhood was not their responsibility. And other than that, they just refused to comment. So now Mike just called them every morning to remind them that he was not going away, and neither was this problem. By the time the receptionist at Hooker Chemical hung up on Mike, a plate of eggs and toast had arrived. Mike thanked the waitress, then drenched his eggs in Tabasco sauce and began to eat. As he ate, Mike barely noticed the neon orange piece of paper sliding onto the bar right next to him. He looked up to see a woman with brown hair and big glasses holding a stack of these orange pieces of paper. They were flyers. He smiled and grabbed the piece of paper she had just slid over to him. Before he could read the flyer, the woman introduced herself as Lois Gibbs and said she knew who he was. She had read his articles in the paper. She told Mike about her son and her neighbors, all of whom she believed had been made sick by the foul, oily liquid that he had written about in those articles. She invited Mike to a community meeting that evening where she and her neighbors would be speaking up about this issue. Mike immediately liked Lois. She seemed like someone who usually tried to blend in, but she had clearly found her voice because she had to. Mike looked down at the flyer and saw there were dates for several other meetings in addition to the one that was happening that night. Mike was very impressed. It was clear this woman was highly organized. And so, after months of working this case alone, Mike suddenly felt a surge of energy. He thanked Lois and promised her that he would be there that night. That night, Mike pulled up outside of a church that was in the next town over from Niagara Falls. Mike walked into the back of the church, then followed a few people downstairs into a big cinder block room with bright overhead lighting. Along the wall was a folding table that had some coffee and a few boxes of homemade cookies. The neon orange flyer said tonight's speakers would discuss a nearby industrial dump site for chemical waste. Mike was eager to better understand how these big industrial plants were disposing of their waste in general. Mike took a seat in a folding chair against the wall, and then just kind of kept a low profile. He just wanted to listen tonight. First, a middle-aged, barrel-chested man stood up and thanked everyone for coming in. Then he made a few announcements before ceding the floor to a young woman. Mike guessed this woman was about 20 years old. She had a determined look on her face as she began telling the crowd about this chemical smell that had been lingering in the air around town. She said that this nasty odor was being caused by an old chemical dump site in town that had recently begun leaking. As the girl spoke, she began to cry because she was clearly very afraid of the fact that she had lived right next to this dump her whole life. She would tell the crowd that the area the dump was in was known by the unusual name of the Love Canal. Mike perked up at the mention of this dump site's name. In all the research he'd done in Niagara Falls, he'd never heard of the Love Canal. And so the moment the barrel-chested man stood back up to end the meeting, Mike shot up from his seat and nearly sprinted out the door. He could not wait to get to his office. 20 minutes later, Mike was back in his office, settling in for what he knew would be a long night of research. It only took a few days for Mike, running on almost no sleep, to uncover a horrifying history. A history that almost no one living in Niagara Falls suspected. Everyone knew that it was a factory town with its share of pollution problems, but what Mike had discovered was far worse than that. He learned that back in the 19th century, a New York businessman named William Love built a canal in the area that was meant to be full of water and produce cheap electric power for a city he wanted to build. But he never finished the project, and the canal just sat unused for 50 years like a big ditch. But in 1942, the Hooker Chemical Company bought the old canal to use as a dump site for their chemical waste. Then Mike was stunned to learn that the US military also began dumping chemicals in the canal. In just 10 years, almost 22,000 tons of chemical waste was dumped into the Love Canal. And after that, the Hooker Chemical Company abandoned the dump in 1953 and sold the land to the Niagara Falls Board of Education for just $1. But in order for them to buy it at just $1, there was a single condition: that Hooker Chemical Company could never be blamed for a lawsuit, injury, or death resulting from the toxic materials they buried in the canal. Mike could not believe the extent of this cover-up. Clearly, Love Canal is what had made Michael Gibbs, Lois's son, and so many other kids and people in this area so unwell. The elementary school and over 100 houses were built directly on top of thousands of pounds of toxic chemical waste. But Mike couldn't help but smile when he thought about the bombshell that was about to land on the front steps of City Hall as soon as his story about this cover-up was published. He thought of his new friend Lois and the other parents who'd been fighting to get 99th Street Elementary shut down, and for the first time in nearly a year, he felt like they really had a shot at making that happen. After Mike's expose on the Love Canal came out, Lois Gibbs led the entire Love Canal community in banding together and taking their fight to the health department. On August 2nd, 1978, the Department of Health officially recommended that the 99th Street Elementary School be shut down. More than 2 years later, on October 1st, 1980, President Jimmy Carter signed a bill to permanently relocate all of the Love Canal residents to safe neighborhoods. Even still, many of them suffered from lifelong health issues. Eventually, more than $20 million in damages was awarded to the 1,300 residents affected by the Love Canal, which included Lois Gibbs's family. As for Lois's son, Michael, his illness would actually just disappear within just 3 days of leaving the 99th Street neighborhood. And Lois would go on to become one of the most prominent environmental activists in the United States, and in 2003, after 25 years of environmental advocacy, she was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize. But even with Lois's amazing efforts to clean up the toxic waste, it had a devastating effect on the community. In total, between 1979 and 1996, it's believed that 725 people died due to exposure to toxic waste from Love Canal, though their death certificates listed other causes such as heart attacks and cancer. But thanks to advocates like Lois Gibbs and Mike Brown, the Hooker Chemical Corporation was forced to spend almost $400 million cleaning up their enormous mess.